The file on my desk contained 17 names, and I had 48 hours to classify all of them before a council session that had already decided what I would find. I had been handed strangers' assignments in my 22 years with the Kareth Verification Bureau, disputed inheritance claims, contested kill counts from border skirmishes, one particularly unpleasant case involving a moleskin trade delegation, and a missing shipment of something I still preferred not to think about. But this one arrived with a personal seal from the High Arbiter herself, and a notation I had not seen on a case file before. Do not route through standard supervisory review, which meant someone in the standard supervisory chain was the problem. My name is Solon, and I measure the dead for a living. Not poetically, literally. The Kareth system of jurisprudence requires that every death occurring within or adjacent to a Federation action be assigned a value. Strategic, incidental, wasteful, or necessary. We do not grieve. We do not memorialize. We categorize because categories can be entered into law and law can be enforced. And enforcement is the only thing that keeps 17,000 species from tearing each other apart in the dark between stars. I pressed 2 fingers against the document's seal and felt the authentication pulse travel up through my palm bones, the Kareth equivalent of a signature, body verified, undeniable. The file opened. 17 names, 1 column of action reports, 1 column marked pending classification. At the bottom, a single line of instruction from the High Arbiter. Verify the human's claim. All 17. Do not rely on the tribunal transcript alone. The human's claim. I had listened to the tribunal recording twice already, the way I always studied primary sources before touching secondary documentation. Captain Marcus Webb, speaking before the Galactic Enforcement Tribunal with the particular calm of a man who had decided in advance that he would not be frightened. His voice carried well even through a translator. Low even, the kind of voice that filled a room without effort. Every Vexillian on that base received a 48-hour warning to evacuate. The 17 who died chose to stay and defend their equipment rather than their lives. That is on them, not us. 17 chose. Simple arithmetic, simple logic. I understood this. The Kareth have a word, Vorath, for a death that results from a choice to protect assets over survival. It is not a heroic death. It is not a shameful death. It is simply a classified death, filed under a specific legal category that determines how liability is apportioned and compensation calculated. Webb's claim, translated into Kareth jurisprudential language, was almost elegant in its tidiness. 17 Vorath deaths, case closed. Except the High Arbiter had sent me specifically, which meant the case was not closed, which meant something in those 17 names was not tidy. I ran my thumb down the list. Vexillian names, Drari names, Quilzian names. I recognized the species distributions immediately, cross-referencing against the 4 separate incidents Webb had described. Mining colony, diplomatic convoy, border stations, research facility, 4 locations, 4 actions, 17 total dead. The mathematics held. Then I reached the last name on the list. Vanek Dmitri, civilian contractor, technical grade 3, Mordak Prime Research Facility. No military designation, no corporate affiliation listed beyond a basic contractor ID. No reason, as far as I could determine from the summary file, for this particular human to have been inside a restricted research facility during an active strike operation. No reason to be there at all. I set down the document and pressed my palm flat against the desk surface, feeling the low vibration of the station's life support systems through the composite material. A habit, a grounding reflex, something my training supervisor had called unnecessary but harmless. The Kareth do not understand stillness the way some species do. We feel the world through pressure and resonance. A silent room is not peaceful to us. It is simply a room where something is stopped. 17 names, 16 with clear affiliations, clear motivations, clear Vorath classifications waiting to be confirmed. 1 name with nothing, a technician, grade 3, Mortak Prime. The Federation wanted this investigation to conclude that Webb was right. 17 choices, 17 consequences, human intervention justified by its own internal logic. I understood the political utility of that conclusion. I was not naive about why the High Arbiter had assigned this to the Verification Bureau rather than simply accepting the tribunal record. But Dmitri Vanek did not fit, and in 22 years of measuring the dead, I had learned one absolute rule. The name that does not fit is always the name that matters most. I opened a new log entry, dated it, and wrote the only honest sentence I could write at the start of any investigation. I do not yet know what happened here. Then I began to read. The tribunal recording ran 4 hours and 17 minutes. I listened to all of it, palm flat on the desk, feeling the station hum shift as the ventilation cycle turned over. 03:00, the hour when skeleton crews walked empty corridors and the official record became the only sound in my office. Webb's voice moved through the translator at a frequency that registered in my secondary hearing as something between confidence and deliberate performance. The Karath do not have a word for the specific quality of a voice that tells the truth while choosing which truths to tell. We probably should. I had isolated the relevant section and played it 6 times. The 17 who died chose to stay and defend their equipment rather than their lives. That is on them, not us. 6 times. And 6 times the statement held up under basic logical scrutiny. Webb had offered evacuation. The dead had declined. Deaths resulting from declined evacuation fell cleanly into Vorath classification. Asset protective mortality, self-elected liability apportioned to the deceased party's employer or ideological affiliation. Clean, documentable, closed, except. I pulled up the personnel manifest from the Mordak Prime strike, the 4th and final incident on my list. The facility had housed 41 individuals at the time of the human operation. 33 research staff, 5 security personnel, 2 administrative contractors, and 1 technical grade 3, listed simply as on-site equipment maintenance, rotational assignment. Dmitry Vanik, rotational assignment, meaning he was not permanently stationed there, meaning he had been scheduled to rotate out 4 days before the strike, meaning he had, according to the logistics manifest I pulled from a secondary Federation database, already been assigned berth on a transport departing Mordak Prime at 06:00 on the morning of the operation. He had missed his transport. I sat with that for a moment, feeling the vibration of the station shift slightly as something heavy moved through the corridor outside. A cargo drone, probably, running its overnight route with the particular mechanical indifference of objects that do not know they are being listened to. Vanik had a transport. Vanik had a berth. Vanik had every logistical mechanism necessary to not be inside that facility when the humans arrived. And yet his name was on my list, last of 17. No classification pending, no Vorath notation, no asset he could conceivably have been protecting. I opened the evacuation record next. Webb had stated that warnings were issued. I needed to verify the form, the timing, the method of delivery. The Karath do not accept second-hand testimony about process. We require the process itself, documented, time-stamped, cross-referenced against independent logs. The warnings had been issued. I confirmed this within 40 minutes of searching. 3 separate alerts pushed to facility-wide communication systems at intervals of 90 minutes, 12 hours, and 48 hours before the strike. Standard human military protocol, graduated warning sequence, civilian evacuation priority. The language in the alerts was direct. Evacuate immediately, transport coordinates attached. This facility will be rendered non-operational, no exceptions. 31 of the 41 people inside Mortak Prime had evacuated successfully. The remaining 10 had not. 7 of those 10 were research staff, scientists who had, according to a personal log recovered from one of their terminals, made a collective decision to remain and attempt destruction of the most sensitive biological samples before the humans could retrieve them. I understood this. Asset protection, Vorath. The classification wrote itself. 2 were security personnel who had engaged the human strike team directly. Also Vorath, straightforwardly documented. And then there was Vanik, who had received all 3 warnings, who had a transport waiting, who had no assets to protect, no orders to remain, no institutional affiliation that would explain his presence in the building after the final alert. His access logs showed him badging out of the facility at 0312, 43 minutes before the strike commenced. He had left. He had physically exited the building. His access logs showed him badging back in at 0331. I stared at that timestamp for a long time. 12 minutes before the operation began, with full knowledge that the building was going to be destroyed, Dmitry Vanik, technical grade 3, rotational maintenance, missed his transport, had walked back through the door. No communication log showed him receiving new orders, no message traffic, no call from the facility director, who had already evacuated. No contact from any human military channel. He had simply turned around. I wrote 3 words in my investigation log and underlined them twice. Verify. Do not assume. Then I flagged Vanek's file for in-person follow-up, cross-referenced every surviving Mortak Prime evacuee against current Federation population registries, and started building my interview list. Somewhere in 31 surviving accounts, someone had seen something. I intended to find out what. My first interview was with a Vexillian named Gorath 7, which was not his full name, but the only portion translatable into a form my equipment could render without a 20-minute phonetic calibration sequence. He had been a shift supervisor at the Kelar 9 mining operation, one of the survivors, which meant he had taken the evacuation warning seriously and departed with time to spare, which meant he had watched from a transport window as the facility his company had spent 9 billion credits constructing was systematically and thoroughly destroyed. He was not happy to be speaking with me. "I've already filed 3 separate testimonies with Federation Legal," he said. "The Vexillian Commerce Guild has 17 attorneys working this case. Whatever you're here to verify, I've already said it to people with more authority than a Karath filing agent." "Verification Bureau," I corrected, which was technically the same thing, but felt important to clarify. "And I'm not here about the Guild's case. I'm here about the deaths." Something shifted in his posture. The secondary arms went still. "Which ones?" "The 17 individuals who remained in the facility after the evacuation warnings. I need your account of the warning sequence, specifically the 48-hour alert. Were you present when it was received?" Gorath 7 looked at me for a long moment with his compound eyes, and I had the familiar Karath experience of being looked at by a species whose visual processing I could not fully model. Too many focal points, too much peripheral coverage, the sensation of being seen from angles I hadn't accounted for. "Yes," he said finally. "I was in the supervisory office when the first alert came through. We thought it was a Federation drill at first. The Guild had been running compliance checks all quarter. When did you determine it was not a drill?" "When the second alert arrived with transport coordinates. Drills don't include transport coordinates." He paused. "That's when Superintendent Vethik told people to start deciding whether to go or stay." Another pause, longer this time. "The equipment on level 7, the deep extraction arrays, couldn't be moved. They were built into the geological substrate. 900 million credits of irreplaceable hardware. Vethik said anyone who wanted to stay and protect the arrays until Guild Legal could challenge the strike order. That was their choice. He made it very clear it was a choice." I noted this carefully. Vorath classification, self-elected, institutional framing provided by a superior officer. Clean. And the 17 who remained, were they all Guild employees? 16 of them. Gorath 7's secondary arms resumed their movement, slower now. The 17th, the human, I don't know what he was doing there. He wasn't one of ours. I looked up from my notes. "Vanek," I said. "I don't know his name. I just remember seeing him in the corridor near the secondary access bay when I was leaving. He was heading toward the exit. I assumed he was evacuating." A pause. "He was not carrying anything." This detail lodged in my mind with the particular insistence of something that would matter later. I noted it and moved on, completed the interview, filed the primary classification for deaths 1 through 3. Vorath, asset protective, guild-directed, liability to the Vexillian Commerce Guild per Standard Federation wrongful retention statute. It was only on the transport back to the station that I realized I had made an error. I had assumed Gorath 7's account closed the Kelar 9 section, but he had told me something I hadn't fully processed. Vanek was heading toward the exit, moving away from the building, which meant that at Kelar 9, a completely different facility, a completely different incident, a human matching Vanek's description had also been present and also appeared to be leaving. I pulled up Vanek's employment record again. Technical Grade 3, rotational assignment, Mortak Prime, not Kelar 9. There was no entry in his file for Kelar 9. No contract, no assignment, no transit record, no reason, logistically or professionally, for him to have been in that corridor at all. I felt something that the Karath do not have a precise term for, a pressure behind the eyes, a change in the resonance of my own thinking, the particular sensation of a model beginning to fail at its edges. One facility, explainable. A technician in the wrong place at the wrong time, 2 facilities. A pattern. I flagged the discrepancy, opened a cross-reference search against all 4 incident sites, and waited for results with my palm pressed flat against the transport wall, feeling the engine vibration, steady and indifferent, all the way back. The cross-reference returned results in 11 minutes. Dmitry Vanik's contractor ID had been logged at all 4 incident sites. I sat with this information the way the Karath sit with structural failures, not with shock, because shock is a mammalian response to violated expectation, and the Karath do not experience violation in quite the same register, but with the particular recalibration that comes when a load-bearing assumption turns out to have been decorative. I had assumed Vanik was a Mortak anomaly. I had built my preliminary model around that assumption. The model was now incorrect. 4 sites, 4 human operations, 4 appearances by a technical grade 3 with no military designation and no operational reason to be present at any of them. I needed to find someone who had actually spoken to him. The Quilzian border station interviews were the most logistically complicated of my 4 case clusters. The surviving guards were distributed across 3 different detention facilities pending Federation legal proceedings, and requesting access required filing separate forms with each administering jurisdiction, 2 of which had apparently developed paperwork incompatibilities with each other that nobody had bothered to resolve. I spent most of one morning on this. The Karath are patient in ways that species with shorter lifespans often find unnerving. I simply worked through the forms in sequence and waited. The guard I eventually reached was named Vesk, a young Quilzian with the compound eye coloration that indicated recent trauma, paler than baseline, the lenses slightly unfocused in ways that weren't correctable with standard optical adjustment. He had been stationed at checkpoint Orindal 7, the 3rd of 4 border stations seized during the human operation. There were 8 of them, he said, in the flat way of someone who had told the same story many times and stopped expecting the telling to help. 8 humans. They came through the secondary docking corridor at 0200. We had received the standard Quilzian emergency protocol: hold position, await command response, do not engage unilaterally. Did you engage? Not immediately. The humans, they did something I hadn't seen before. They stopped, outside the checkpoint perimeter. They stopped, and one of them, not the commander I don't think, walked forward alone, slowly, hands visible. I noted this. Human restraint pattern consistent with other accounts. Did this individual speak? He spoke in 3 languages before finding one I could understand. His Quilzian was poor but functional. Vesk was quiet for a moment. He told me to open the detention manifest. He said there were 417 individuals in the processing system, and he wanted to verify they were still alive before anything else happened. Before anything else happened, I repeated. He said if they were alive and unharmed, there didn't need to be a confrontation. He said that was the only thing he was there to confirm. Another pause. He was not carrying a weapon. His team was, I could see them in the corridor, but he wasn't. Did you open the manifest? Vesk's eye coloration shifted slightly. Yes, I didn't ask why. The answer was visible in the shift of his lenses, in the particular frequency of his translator output, the slightly elevated resonance that the Karath associate with a being who has made a decision they are still making peace with. He had opened the manifest because something about an unarmed being walking forward slowly and asking to verify that people were still alive had overridden his protocol training in a way he hadn't anticipated and still didn't fully understand. The individual who walked forward, I said carefully, "Can you describe him?" Vesk described a human of average height, with a particular physical density that several witnesses had now used the word compact to convey, wearing a maintenance-grade uniform rather than military kit. Dark hair, a small repair tool, the kind used for atmospheric seal work, visible in a chest pocket. Atmospheric seal repair, technical work, rotational assignment. I showed him the contractor file image. Vesk looked at it for 4 seconds. Yes, he said, that's him. I closed my notebook and spent a moment pressing my palm to the detention facility table, feeling the different vibration here, older infrastructure, heavier material, the particular resonance of a building that had been built to contain things rather than move them. Vanik had walked point at Quilzian checkpoint Orindal 7, unarmed, ahead of a combat team in a maintenance uniform asking to see a detention manifest. He was not a tactician. He was not a negotiator. He had no formal training that I could locate in any database for either function. What he apparently had was the specific quality of being the kind of person who walked forward slowly, with his hands visible, and spoke 3 languages badly, until he found one that worked. I was beginning to understand why the High Arbiter had told me not to rely on the tribunal transcript alone. Webb had said 17 people chose to stay and fight. Vanek had not stayed and fought. At Kellar 9 he was leaving. At Orindal 7 he was walking forward. At Mordek he had left and then, for reasons I still could not classify, turned around and walked back in. The Vorath framework did not account for a person who kept moving toward things. I flagged Vanek's file as primary, reclassified everything else as contextual, and booked the next transport to the Mordek Prime Survivor Settlement. Whatever had happened in that facility in the 12 minutes before the strike, I needed to hear it from someone who had been inside. The Mordek Prime Survivor Settlement was not on any official Federation map. This was intentional. The 31 individuals who had evacuated the research facility had, upon discovering that their former employer's work involved engineering plagues categorized by species-specific genetic markers, collectively declined to return to anything resembling their previous lives. 3 had entered Federation witness protection. 7 had simply disappeared into the outer transit networks in the way that people disappear when they have decided that being findable is no longer a priority they share with the institutions looking for them. The remaining 21 had pooled resources and settled on a marginal agricultural moon in a system that appeared on trade charts only as a fuel depot notation and a warning about irregular gravity fluctuations. It took me 4 days to find them. The settlement was small. Prefabricated structures arranged with the particular pragmatic efficiency of people who had built something quickly and then been surprised to find themselves still living in it 2 years later. Children ran between the buildings, which I noted without fully processing at first, and then processed more carefully. Research staff, mostly unmarried or partnered without family, the demographic profile of people who had dedicated their working lives to institutional science rather than the construction of personal ones. Children. In a settlement of 21 adults with no family background, I flagged the detail and moved on. The woman who agreed to speak with me was named Dr. Fela Orisanwo, Mortak Prime's former head of atmospheric chemistry, one of the 6 who had stayed behind attempting to destroy samples, one of the 3 who had survived, one of the 2 willing to be interviewed. She was a small woman with the particular physical quality of someone who had been ill and recovered and would carry the recovery in her body permanently. She walked slowly. She chose her chair with care. She did not seem surprised to see me. "The Kareth Verification Bureau," she said, reading my credentials with the focus of someone accustomed to reading fine print in laboratory documentation. "You're here about the 17. "I'm here about one specifically," I said, "Dmitry Vanek." Something moved across her face that my training identified as grief, and my instincts identified as something more complicated. The expression of a person who had been expecting a question and had not decided yet whether they wanted to answer it. "He fixed our atmospheric seals," she said finally. "Rotational contractor, came through every 6 weeks. He knew the facility layout better than most of the permanent staff." A pause. "He was supposed to be gone. I saw him leave. He came back." "Yes. Why?" Dr. Orisanwa was quiet for long enough that I began to recalibrate whether she intended to answer at all. Outside the prefabricated wall, I could hear children, the specific high-frequency resonance of young beings playing without awareness of being listened to. The sound moved through the composite material differently than adult voices, higher, more irregular. "There was a child in the facility," she said at last. "My colleague Parveen's daughter, 4 years old. Parveen brought her sometimes when the regular childcare fell through. The facility director disapproved but never formally prohibited it. That morning, when the alerts came, Parveen put Anya in the secondary storage room, the one with the reinforced walls, positive atmospheric pressure, emergency rations. She thought it was the safest place. She was going to go back for her. She stopped. She didn't make it back. I held very still. Vanek knew," Dr. Orisanwo said. "He'd seen Anya that morning during his last maintenance check before leaving. When he was outside, when he was already out, he must have realized." She stopped. "I don't know what he thought. I don't know if he thought he'd make it in time. I know that he heard her through the storage room wall, because we found the access log and the timing. And there's no other explanation for why he went to that specific corridor. Did he get her out? I asked, though I already knew part of the answer from the presence of children in this settlement, from the detail I had noted and not yet fully processed. Dr. Orasanwo looked at me steadily. Anya is the one playing outside, she said. She turned 6 last month. I did not interview Captain Yara Ose on my first attempt. Her liaison officer, a young human in a uniform that managed to look both military and deliberately non-threatening, informed me that Captain Ose was currently occupied with a debrief sequence related to a separate ongoing operation, and that my request had been logged and would be responded to within 5 to 7 standard days. I told him I would wait. He seemed uncertain what to do with this information. The Karath are not, in my experience, what other species consider comfortable to be around when we are waiting. We do not make conversation. We do not find other tasks to occupy ourselves with. We simply remain in the space we have chosen to remain in and process information until the situation changes. I sat in the corridor outside the liaison office for 11 hours. By the 3rd hour, the young officer had stopped checking whether I was still there. By the 7th, he had started bringing me water, which I did not drink but acknowledged with the appropriate head inclination, because the gesture seemed to mean something to him. Osi emerged at 2140. She was a tall woman with close-cut hair and the specific physical economy of someone who had learned not to waste movement, every gesture functional, nothing decorative. She looked at me in the corridor outside her liaison office with the expression of someone who had been told I was waiting, and had decided, somewhere in the preceding 11 hours, how she intended to handle this. Verification Bureau, she said. Yes, 17 deaths. One specifically, Dmitry Vanek. She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. The Karath notice intervals like this. 3 seconds is long enough to be a decision, not long enough to be uncertainty. Come in, she said. The office was small and functional. She sat across from me without offering anything, which I respected. Karath interviews proceed better without the social lubrication that some species require before they can speak plainly. She folded her hands on the desk and looked at me with the particular directness of someone who had decided that the easiest way through this was straight. What do you need to know? She said. Whether Vanek received orders to re-enter the facility? No. Whether he communicated with any member of your team between badging out and badging back in? No. Whether you were aware, at the time of the operation, that there was a child in the facility. The 3-second interval again. Longer, this time. Yes, she said. I wrote this down carefully. When did you become aware? Approximately 40 minutes before the strike commenced. One of our intelligence contacts flagged an anomaly in the facility's life support allocation. Slightly elevated atmospheric output in the secondary storage section. Inconsistent with the listed occupancy. She paused. It was consistent with a small child. What action did you take? I attempted to reach the facility director to request emergency evacuation of the storage section. He had already evacuated and was not responding to communication. Another pause. I sent a message to the general facility emergency channel, advising of a possible occupant in secondary storage and requesting immediate verification. Did Vanek receive this message? The message went to all active contractor IDs in the facility system. She looked at me steadily. He had badged out 11 minutes before I sent it. Whether it reached his personal device, I cannot confirm that. I sat with this. The facility system would have routed the alert to active IDs. Personnel still logged as inside the building. Vanek had badged out before the alert, which meant he may have walked back in without knowing about the child at all. Or he had seen a 4-year-old that morning during a maintenance check and done the mathematics himself. Captain Osi, I said. In the tribunal, Captain Webb stated that 17 individuals chose to remain and defend their positions. Did he know about Vanek's circumstances when he made that statement? The interval this time was not 3 seconds. It was long enough that I became aware again of the station's ventilation cycle, the low pressure shift of air moving through the corridor outside, the particular resonance of a space that was otherwise completely silent. Webb knew, she said. Then why did it not distinguish Vanek's death from the others in his testimony? Osi looked at me for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had not changed in volume or register, but something in the frequency of it had shifted. Lower, more compressed. the quality of a sound that had been carrying weight for a long time. Because the truth about Dmitri doesn't fit into a political argument, she said. He wasn't defending equipment. He wasn't following orders. He wasn't making a statement about Federation corruption or human moral superiority. A pause. He hurt a child, that's all. And Webb needed 17 clean deaths. Not 16 clean deaths and one man who turned around because he heard something through a wall. She looked at the desk surface between us. So he simplified it, she said, and I let him. I wrote this down. Outside, somewhere in the station, a shift change was beginning. I could feel it in the vibration pattern. The subtle pressure increase of more bodies moving through corridors. The particular frequency of a place returning to full operational rhythm. The ordinary texture of a day that did not know it was being recorded. One more question, I said. Did Vanek get the child out? Osi's expression shifted into something I did not have a Karath classification for. Not grief exactly, not relief. Something that occupied the space between them, where a thing that cost everything had also somehow been worth the cost. He got her to the secondary airlock, she said. He sealed her in with an emergency atmospheric pack and triggered the exterior release manually from inside. A pause. The airlock cycled 11 seconds before the strike. I looked at my notes. Then I looked at Captain Osi, who was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who had said a true thing and was now living in the silence after it. He knew he wasn't going to make it out, I said. Yes, she said, he knew. The 7 scientists who stayed at Mordak Prime had left personal logs. This was not unusual, researchers document. It is the professional reflex of people whose entire value to their institutions consists of turning observation into record. They log experiments. They log results. They log the decisions they make and the reasoning behind them. Because an undocumented conclusion is not a conclusion. It is merely an opinion. What was unusual was that the Federation legal team had flagged all 7 logs as classified pending investigation, which meant accessing them required a Verification Bureau override, which I filed at 0600 and received at 0840, which was faster than I had expected, and suggested someone in the approval chain had decided that cooperation with my investigation was preferable to whatever the alternative looked like. I read all 7 in sequence. 6 of them were, in their essential structure, the same document. Different voices, different scientific specializations, different levels of prose quality, but the same decision, the same reasoning, the same architecture of choice. They had seen the samples. They had understood what the samples represented. They had calculated, each in their own way, that destroying the research was worth more than their survival. And they had stayed. Vorath. Asset protective mortality, self-elected. The classification held without pressure. The 7th log belonged to a security officer named Fenwick, 62 years old, 23 years of facility protection work across 9 different postings, the kind of employment history that accumulates in people who are reliable rather than ambitious. His log was short. 0347, alerts confirmed genuine. Dr. Vasquez and the others are staying. I'm staying with them. That's the job. That was the entire entry. I sat with Fenwick's 7 words for longer than was professionally necessary. That's the job. Not asset protection in the Vorath sense. Not a calculation of institutional value against personal survival. Something simpler and, from a Karath analytical framework, significantly harder to categorize. He had not stayed because the samples were worth his life. He had stayed because 6 people he knew were staying. And leaving them alone in a building that was going to be destroyed was something he could not make himself do. The Karath have a term for dying in defense of a specific individual. Kreshvareth, loyalty death, a recognized legal category with defined liability structures and memorial protocols. We have used it for 40 generations. We do not have a term for staying because leaving felt wrong. I filed Fenwick under Kreshvareth with a notation that the classification was approximate and moved on, because the alternative was sitting in that approximation until it became a problem. And I had 7 more files to process before my transport window. The cross-reference I had run earlier returned a secondary result I had deprioritized and now needed to address. Vanek's contractor ID had not merely appeared at all 4 incident sites. His transit records showed him arriving at each location between 3 and 11 days before the human operations commenced. Not during, before. I looked at this for a long time. The simplest explanation was logistical coincidence. A rotational contractor cycling through facilities that subsequently became operational targets was not inherently suspicious, particularly if human intelligence had been monitoring those facilities for some time, and Vonek's rotation schedule happened to align with their operational timeline. The second explanation was that Vonek was part of the intelligence infrastructure, a technical contractor moving through restricted facilities, noting layouts, flagging life support anomalies, passing information to human military contacts through channels that would not appear in standard communication logs. This explanation was clean. It was documentable. It would classify Vonek's presence at all 4 sites as operational rather than coincidental, his death at Mortak as Vorath of a specific military-adjacent subtype. The entire file closed with appropriate notation. I wrote it up, read it back, filed it in the draft folder. Then I opened Dr. Orasanwo's interview transcript and read her account of the morning maintenance check. Vanek moving through the atmospheric systems, Anya following him between the corridor junctions, the way small children follow people who do not tell them to stop. Vanek fixing a seal coupling on the secondary storage room door while a 4-year-old watched with the focused attention of someone encountering mechanical work for the first time. He had been in that corridor. He had fixed that door. He had seen exactly where she was. An intelligence asset would have noted the child as a liability, would have flagged it up the chain, would have waited for someone with authority to make a decision about evacuation protocol. Vanek had fixed the door, completed his maintenance checklist, and left, and then turned around. I deleted the draft. Whatever Vanek had been doing at the other 3 sites, I could not make the intelligence explanation fit the 12 minutes at Mortak. It explained too much and the wrong things. It gave him a reason to be present and no reason at all for what he actually did. I needed a different framework entirely. The problem was that I didn't have one. The High Arbiter's second message arrived while I was in transit back to the central station. It was shorter than the first. It read, "Progress report required within 48 hours. Council session scheduled. Recommendation expected." I read it twice, feeling the transport's engine vibration through the seat frame, a higher frequency than the station, less stable, the particular resonance of a vessel that was functional rather than comfortable. Then I filed it without responding, because I had nothing to report that the High Arbiter would find useful, and the Karath do not submit incomplete documentation simply because a deadline is approaching. The council session explained the pressure. I had known there was a political dimension to this investigation. The High Arbiter's personal seal on the original assignment had made that clear. But I had allowed myself the professional comfort of treating it as background noise while I worked the primary material. The background noise had now become the foreground. I understood the structure of what was being asked of me. The Federation Tribunal had produced a record. 17 deaths, human intervention justified. Webb's argument compelling if legally irregular. Several Federation member states were now using that record as the basis for reform proposals. New oversight mechanisms, revised enforcement protocols, a formal review of the cases Webb had cited as evidence of systemic failure. The proposals were gaining traction. The Quilzian hegemony had lost 4 council votes in the preceding month. The Vexillian Commerce Guild was facing 3 separate criminal investigations. The council members who had the most to lose from continued momentum wanted the 17 deaths reclassified. Not disputed, reclassified. Shifted from Vorath into a category that implied human aggression rather than human intervention. If the 17 could be reframed as innocent casualties rather than complicit actors who had made their own choices, the entire moral architecture of Webb's tribunal argument collapsed. The humans became perpetrators, the Federation became victim. The reform proposals became solutions to the wrong problem. It was, from a purely structural standpoint, an elegant political maneuver. It required only that I produce a verification report supporting the reclassification. I had 16 deaths that classified cleanly as Vorath and would not support reclassification regardless of political pressure. The documentation was too complete, the witness testimony too consistent, the actions of the deceased too clearly self-directed. Any attempt to reclassify those 16 would face immediate legal challenge and fail. But Vanek was different. Vanek had no clear Vorath classification. His presence at the facility was anomalous. His return was undocumented. His death could, with careful framing and selective use of the available evidence, be presented as the death of an unarmed civilian contractor caught in a military operation, collateral mortality, human-caused, legally actionable. It would not be accurate, but it would be documentable in the specific way that documentation can be true in every individual component and false in its assembled meaning. I was sitting with this when the transport docked and the liaison officer who had brought me water for 11 hours was waiting at the corridor junction with an expression that suggested he had been told to expect me and was uncertain how to convey that the person who had told him to expect me was not someone I could decline to meet. Director Vane is requesting a briefing, he said, now if convenient. Director Vane was the Karath Federation liaison, the senior Karath official whose institutional function placed him between the High Arbiter's investigative branch and the council members who funded both. He was not my superior in any direct organizational sense. He was, however, the person who approved Verification Bureau budget allocations on an annual basis, which, in practical terms, meant he occupied a position of significant influence over the professional futures of everyone in my department. I had met him twice. Both times he had been pleasant in the specific way of people who have learned that pleasantness is more effective than pressure at producing the outcomes they want. His office was larger than mine. The view screen showed a real-time feed of the station's exterior, stars moving slowly past in the long rotation, the particular cold beauty of deep space rendered decorative by distance and transparency. Solon, he said, gesturing to a chair. How is the investigation progressing? I am still gathering material, I said. Of course, he smiled. The council session is in 46 hours. The High Arbiter has indicated your report will be submitted before then. That was the timeline I was given, yes. 16 of the 17 deaths seem relatively straightforward from what I understand. That's protective mortality, self-elected. He paused. The 17th is the complication. Vanek, I said. Vanek. He nodded slowly, as though we had arrived together at a conclusion that had in fact been waiting for me since before I took this assignment. A civilian contractor, unarmed, present in a facility during a military strike operation. The council's legal team believes there is a viable case for reclassification as collateral civilian mortality. The council's legal team has not reviewed the full case material, I said. No, he agreed. They've reviewed what was submitted to the tribunal, which is, of course, incomplete. He looked at me with the pleasant expression. That's why we have the Verification Bureau. I felt the particular pressure shift that the Karath experience when a conversation reveals its actual architecture. When the surface structure of an exchange peels back and the load-bearing elements become visible. Director Vane was not asking me for my findings. He was telling me what my findings should be in the careful language of institutional suggestion, where nothing is stated directly and everything is understood. I looked at the view screen, stars moving past in the long rotation. I will submit my report before the council session, I said. He smiled. Good. I left his office and stood in the corridor outside with my palm against the wall, feeling the station vibrate around me. The full operational frequency of a place running at capacity. Thousands of beings moving through their days in the ordinary way of beings who do not know they are inside someone else's decision. 46 hours. 16 clean classifications and one man who had turned around because he heard something through a wall, and an institution asking me to make that death into something it was not. I began walking back to my office. I had a report to write. I wrote the reclassification report in 4 hours. It was not difficult. The Karath are trained documentarians. We know how to build a case from available evidence, how to select the details that support a conclusion, and frame the gaps in ways that do not invite challenge. Vanek's file contained enough genuine ambiguity that a careful reading could support multiple interpretations. His presence at the facility was anomalous. His return was undocumented by direct order. His death occurred during a military operation he had no formal role in. Collateral civilian mortality. Human-caused. Legally actionable. Every sentence in the report was technically accurate. The transit records were real. The contractor classification was real. The absence of documented orders was real. I had not invented anything. I had simply arranged the true things in the order that produced the conclusion Director Vane required, and left the other true things in the folder marked supplementary material, where they would be available if anyone requested them, and invisible if no one did. I read it back twice. It was good work in the technical sense. Clean logic, appropriate citations, no overreach. A verification bureau report that would pass review at every institutional level, because every institutional level had already decided what it needed the report to say. I saved it to the submission queue and set the release timer for 0600 6 hours before the council session. Enough time for distribution, not enough time for meaningful challenge. Then I did something I had not planned. I made tea, Karath style, which involves a specific water temperature and a steep time of exactly 4 minutes, because my clutch mother believed that imprecise tea was evidence of imprecise thinking. I drank it standing at the window, watching the station's exterior feed, stars moving in the long, slow rotation, the cold beauty of deep space rendered decorative by distance and glass. The report was good work. I knew it was good work. Every sentence defensible, every citation accurate, every gap in the record handled with appropriate hedging language that would survive legal scrutiny without inviting challenge. It was the best version of the wrong thing I had ever produced, and in the particular stillness of 0445 with tea going cold in my hand, I found I could not locate the satisfaction I had expected to feel. I set down the cup. I opened Vonek's personnel file one more time. I am not certain why. The file contained the standard contractor documentation, employment history, transit records, maintenance logs from 9 different facilities across 4 years, a photograph taken at credential issuance, standard lighting, neutral expression, the particular flatness of an image taken by someone who photographs hundreds of people and has stopped seeing them as individuals. Vonek had dark hair going gray at the temples. He was 34 years old in the photograph, which meant he had been 34 years old when he died, which was a fact I had processed several times without it registering as anything beyond data. Below the photograph, the standard next of kin field. 1 entry. A sister named Marta Vanek, listed at a residential address in a mid-tier Federation colony. I looked at the sister's name for a moment. Then I looked at my report in the submission queue. Marta Vanek would receive a notification. Standard Federation Contractor Mortality Protocol. A message generated by the legal department of whatever agency had administered Vonek's contractor status, informing her that her brother had died during an incident at Mortac Prime Research Facility, that his estate would be processed according to standard contractor bereavement protocol, that a liaison officer would be in contact regarding any outstanding compensation claims. But if she asked if Marta Vanek contacted a lawyer or a journalist or a Federation Accountability Office and asked what the official classification of her brother's death was, she would be told that he had been killed by human military action, that his death was actionable, that there was a legal pathway available to her if she chose to pursue it. She would not be told that he had fixed a door seal on a storage room where a 4-year-old was playing. She would not be told that he had left the building and turned around. She would not be told that Anya was 6 years old now and lived in a settlement on a marginal agricultural moon and played outside in the afternoon light. She would be told a true thing arranged to mean a false thing. I deleted the report from the submission queue. It took approximately 3 seconds. The file cleared. The timer disappeared. The queue showed empty. I had 38 hours until the council session. I opened a new document and wrote at the top, in the formal register of Karath official record, verification report, case 717, primary filing. Below that, I wrote the only sentence that was true in every direction at once. The classification of death 17 requires a category that does not currently exist in Karath jurisprudence. Then I started writing the real report. The real report began with a problem of language. The Karath jurisprudential system contains 417 distinct classifications for death. We developed them over 3 centuries of legal refinement, drawing on case records from 42 member species, cross-referenced against 17 different philosophical frameworks for assigning moral weight to mortality. The system is comprehensive. It is the professional pride of the Verification Bureau and the foundational architecture of Karath participation in Federation law. It did not contain a classification for Dmitry Vanek. I had already known this. What I had not known until I sat down to write honestly about why, was how much the absence revealed. Every Kareth classification assumes a calculation. Vorath, asset protective mortality, assumes the deceased weighed survival against institutional value and chose the institution. Kresh Vorath, loyalty death, assumes the deceased weighed survival against a specific bond and chose the bond. Even our classifications for accidental death assume a chain of decisions that can be traced backward to a point of origin. A moment where a different choice would have produced a different outcome. A place where responsibility can be assigned and recorded and filed. Vanek had made a calculation. He had left the building. He had done the rational thing, the survival thing, the thing that every Kareth classification assumed was the default from which all other choices were deviations. And then he had heard something. I pulled the audio log and listened to it again, alone in my office at 0200, with the station running at minimal staffing, and the corridor outside empty and the ventilation system cycling through its overnight sequence with the patient indifference of machinery that does not experience the hours between midnight and dawn as different from any other hours. The log was 47 seconds long. The first 19 seconds were ambient facility sound, the hum of atmospheric systems, the low-frequency vibration of the building's structural frame, the particular acoustic texture of an empty corridor in a building that was mostly evacuated. Then at the 19-second mark, a sound that my audio analysis software classified as juvenile vocalization, distress pattern, species undetermined, small, muffled, coming through a wall. At the 23rd second, footsteps, moving away from the sound first, 2 steps, 3, and then stopping. 4 seconds of silence, the Kareth notice intervals. 4 seconds is long enough to hear something twice, long enough to locate it, long enough to understand what you are hearing and what it means and what it will cost you to respond to it. At the 28th second, the footsteps turned around. I listened to those footsteps cross the corridor. I listened to the access panel activate on the storage room door, the specific electronic tone of a badge reader processing a credential. I listened to the door open, and the child's crying become briefly louder as the acoustic barrier disappeared, and then diminish as she registered the presence of someone who had come. Vanek did not speak. There was no reassurance offered, no explanation given, no words at all. Whatever passed between a 34-year-old maintenance contractor and a 4-year-old in a sealed storage room in the 12 minutes before a military strike, it did not require language. The log captured only movement, the sound of a small person being lifted, carried, moved through a corridor at a pace calibrated to urgency without panic. The airlock sequence began at 0342. The exterior release triggered at 0343 from the interior control panel. The log ended 11 seconds later when the facility's power grid went offline. I sat in the silence after the recording for a long time. The Kareth do not have a word for the specific quality of a choice made in 4 seconds in a corridor, alone, with full knowledge of the cost. We have Vorath and Kresh Vorath and 17 other categories that parse the relationship between survival and obligation, between self and institution, between the individual life and the structures that give it meaning. We do not have a word for a man who stops walking away because a sound reaches him through a wall, and something in him decides, in 4 seconds, that the sound is more important than everything else. I thought about what Webb had said in the tribunal. Every Vexillian on that base received a 48-hour warning. The 17 who died chose to stay. He was not wrong. Vanek had chosen. The choice was just not the one Webb had described. Not a political choice, not a moral statement about Federation corruption, not a calculated act of resistance or solidarity or principle. A sound through a wall, 4 seconds, footsteps turning around. I thought about Osi's face when she said he knew. The weight she had been carrying since Mortak, the simplification she had permitted because Webb needed clean deaths, and Vanek's death was not clean. It was the opposite of clean. It was the most complicated and most irreducible thing I had encountered in 22 years of classifying the dead. I wrote in the report, Death 17 cannot be classified under existing Kareth jurisprudential framework because it does not originate in a calculation. It originates in a response. The distinction is not semantic. It is foundational. Then I wrote, the Verification Bureau recommendation is as follows. The case should not be closed. It should be used. I looked at that sentence for a long time before I continued. There is something in the human institutional structure that produces individuals capable of a 4-second decision in an empty corridor. This is not a tactical capability. It is not a training outcome. It is something that the Karath system of jurisprudence has spent 3 centuries assuming did not exist, because we built our entire classification framework on the premise that all choices are ultimately calculable. Von Eck's choice was not calculable, and a species that produces uncalculable choices in ordinary people, not heroes, not soldiers, not ideologues, but maintenance contractors on rotational assignment, is a species whose deaths we do not yet have the language to describe. We should learn the language before we decide what to do with the species. I submitted the report at 0530. Then I sat in my office and waited to find out what it would cost me. The response came in 6 hours, not from the High Arbiter, not from Director Vayen, from the Council legal team directly, which meant someone had read the report faster than normal processing time allowed and made phone calls before breakfast, which meant the report had landed exactly where I had intended it to land, and the people it was intended to disturb were disturbed. The message was formal in the specific way of documents written by people who are angry and have lawyers. It cited 4 separate procedural regulations governing Verification Bureau submission protocols. It noted that my report had been filed without supervisory review. While it was technically accurate, I had bypassed Director Vayen's approval chain entirely, routing directly out of the High Arbiter's office and simultaneously to the Open Federation record, which was a submission pathway that existed in the Bureau's founding charter and had not been used in 31 years because nobody had needed to use it and everybody had forgotten it was there. I had found it at Oro 400 between finishing the report and submitting it, during the 40 minutes when I was sitting with the decision and looking for reasons not to make it. The message demanded a retraction within 12 hours. I filed a formal acknowledgement of receipt, which was required by protocol, and did not file a retraction, which was not. By 1400, 3 things had happened. The first was that Director Vayen requested an immediate meeting, which I declined on the grounds that I had active case material to process, which was true. I had 17 open supplementary files that technically remained under investigation until the primary report was formally accepted or challenged through proper legal channels, and proper legal channels took time. And until they concluded, I had professional obligations that superseded a liaison meeting. The second was that a journalist at a mid-tier Federation news service filed a public record request for my full case documentation, which was automatically granted under Federation transparency statutes within 2 hours of submission, which meant that by 1600, a person with 200,000 followers on the standard Federation communication network had published a summary of the audio log, the 47 seconds, the 4-second interval, the footsteps turning around. The summary was not accurate in every detail. Journalists rarely are, but it was accurate in the way that matters for public understanding. It conveyed the shape of the truth without distorting it beyond recognition, and it asked, in the plain language of someone writing for people who were not lawyers or jurisprudential specialists, a question that turned out to be the same question I had asked at 0200 in an empty office. Why did the Federation's legal team want this death classified as a human crime? The third thing that happened was that Captain Osi sent me a message. It was 2 sentences. I read your report. Thank you for writing it correctly. I sat with that for a moment. The particular frequency of a message from someone who had been carrying a weight and had felt it shift, not disappear. The Karath understand that true things do not erase costs, but shift. I filed her message in the case record because it was relevant documentation and because I wanted it to be part of the official archive. By 1800, the journalist's summary had been shared 400,000 times across the Federation communication network. By 2000, it had been picked up by 3 major outlets. By 2200, a Quilsian Reform Coalition had issued a formal statement citing my report as evidence that the reclassification effort was politically motivated. At 2300, Director Vayen's office issued a statement indicating that the original reclassification request was under internal review and that no final determination had been made. This was the language institutions use when they have decided to retreat and need time to arrange the retreat so it does not look like retreat. I noted it without satisfaction. Satisfaction requires an endpoint, and this was not an endpoint. I was still sitting with the thing that mattered, which was not the political reversal, or the journalist's summary, or Director Vane's managed withdrawal. It was the question I had written into the report at 0500, and which had not become less urgent because circumstances had moved in a favorable direction, a species that produces uncalculable choices in ordinary people. I pulled up the Federation Population Registry and found the residential address listed in Vonnick's next of kin field. Marta Vonnick, a mid-tier colony, 6 transit hours from the central station. I sent a message requesting contact at her convenience. Then I opened the case file and started working on what came next. Marta Vonnick responded within the hour. This surprised me. It was past midnight at her colony's local time, which meant she had not been sleeping, which meant she had probably already seen the journalist's summary, which meant the conversation I had been preparing for had already begun without me. She agreed to a direct communication link. Her face, when it appeared on my screen, was the face of someone who had been crying recently and had decided to stop. Dark hair like her brother's, the same quality of compact, physical presence that several witnesses had used to describe him, eyes that were focused in the way of people who are holding themselves together through the specific effort of paying close attention to something external. "You wrote the report," she said. "Not a question." "Yes, you listened to the audio log." Yes, she was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, I could see a fragment of it over her shoulder. It was dark. The particular darkness of a colony settlement without significant light pollution, stars visible in a way they rarely are from station environments. "He called me," she said, "the morning of, before his transport was supposed to leave." A pause. I didn't answer. It was early and I was tired, and I thought I'd call him back that evening. I did not say anything. The Kareth understand that some silences are not gaps to be filled. "What was he like?" I asked finally. "Before all of this." She looked at me with an expression I was learning to recognize. The particular quality of grief that arrives when someone asks the question that matters instead of the question that's expected. "He fixed things," she said. "That was Dimitri. If something was broken, he couldn't walk past it. Didn't matter if it was his job or not. A small sound that might have been a laugh in different circumstances. Our mother used to say he was constitutionally incapable of leaving well enough alone." I thought about a maintenance contractor stopping to fix a door seal on a storage room while a 4-year-old watched. "The report," Marta said. "The new classification you're recommending. What does it mean practically?" "It means his death will be entered into Federation legal record under a category that accurately describes what he did," I said. "It cannot be used to build a case against the human military action. It cannot be reclassified as collateral civilian mortality for political purposes. It becomes what it actually was." "And what was it actually?" "I don't have a Kareth word for it yet," I said. "I'm working on that." She looked at me steadily. "He would have hated being famous," she said. "He was very private. He didn't like being the center of attention." Another pause. "He would have said he just did what anyone would do." "Not anyone," I said. "No," she agreed quietly. "Not anyone." We sat in that for a moment, the distance between what Vonnick had believed about himself and what the 47 seconds actually contained. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and you are not obligated to answer." She waited. "The 4 seconds," I said, "in the audio log," before he turned around. "I have been trying to understand what happened in those 4 seconds. Whether there is something in your understanding of him, in what you knew of how he thought, that explains it." Marta Vonnick looked at me across 6 transit hours of distance and several kinds of grief and the particular silence of a colony settlement at midnight. "I don't think it needs explaining," she said. "I think he just heard her." She said it simply, the way you say things that are true in every direction at once. I wrote it in my case notes verbatim, not because it was legally useful, because it was the most accurate description of the 47 seconds that anyone had given me. And accuracy was the only thing I had been able to offer her brother. We spoke for another 20 minutes about practical matters, notification protocol, estate processing, the timeline for official classification. She was composed and precise and did not ask me anything I couldn't answer honestly. Before she ended the call, she said one more thing. "Thank you for not making him into something political," she said. "He was just my brother." After she disconnected, I sat in my office for a long time. He was just my brother, 34 years old, dark hair going gray at the temples, constitutionally incapable of leaving well enough alone. I opened my report and added one line to the recommendations section, below everything else, in plain language rather than formal register. He heard her. That is sufficient. The Kareth High Council convened in a chamber that had not changed in 200 years. This was intentional. The architecture of Kareth institutional spaces is designed to capitulate permanence. High ceilings cut from composite stone, surfaces that absorb sound rather than reflecting it, lighting calibrated to the specific frequency that Kareth visual processing associates with clarity and formal weight. The chamber says, without words, decisions made here have been made for a long time and will continue to be made for a long time, and you are a small thing moving through a large continuity. I had testified here 4 times in my career. Each time the chamber had done its work on me. The particular compression of self that occurs when you stand in a space built to make you feel precisely as significant as the institution requires you to be. This time I noticed it without feeling it, which was new. The 7 council members, arranged in their elevated arc, represented the senior jurisprudential authority of Kareth civilization. 3 had read my full report. The other 4 had read the summary prepared by Director Vane's office, which accurately conveyed the conclusions while substantially minimizing the 47 seconds. High Arbiter Sen spoke first. She was the oldest member of the council, which, among the Kareth, means she had survived more institutional crises than anyone else in the chamber. Investigator Solon, she said, your report has created a considerable amount of difficulty. Yes, I said. The council legal team has identified 14 procedural irregularities in your submission process. I'm aware of 13 of them, I said. I'd be interested to know which one I missed. A brief silence. Two of the council members shifted in their chairs with a particular micro-movement of beings who had not expected that response. The substance of the report, said Council Member Drev, who handled jurisprudential classification. You are recommending the creation of a new legal category based on a single case. This is irregular at minimum and constitutionally questionable at maximum. The classification system requires extensive cross-species consultation, comparative legal analysis, a minimum of 3 supporting case precedents. I'm aware of the requirements, I said. I'm not recommending the council create the category this session. I'm recommending the council acknowledge that the category is necessary and begin the process. On the basis of one contractor's death. On the basis of one contractor's death that the existing system cannot accurately describe, I said. The inadequacy isn't in the case. The inadequacy is in the system. Walk me through the classification failure, Arbiter Sen said. Not a challenge, a genuine request. I walked through it. Vorath. The asset protective framework. The assumption that all choices resolve to a calculation of institutional value against personal survival. The way the entire classification system, across all 417 categories, assumed that the baseline sentient moves through the world by weighing outcomes and selecting the option that maximizes some definable interest. Vonek's choice does not fit this model, I said. Not because he was irrational. He was not irrational. He heard a sound and he responded to it. But the response was not preceded by a calculation. There was no weighing of outcomes. There was a sound and a direction and 4 seconds, and then he moved. You cannot know what occurred in 4 seconds of internal processing, Drev said. You are extrapolating psychological state from behavioral data, which is standard jurisprudential practice, I said. Every Vorath classification extrapolates motivation from behavior. I am doing the same thing. The difference is that my extrapolation produces a result the existing categories cannot accommodate, and yours produces a result that is administratively convenient but factually inadequate. The chamber absorbed this in the way its acoustics absorbed everything, fully, without echo, leaving only the original sound and the silence after it. Councilmember Veth, who handled interspecies legal relations, spoke without looking up from her documentation. The Human Military Command has submitted a formal observation regarding this case. It was received this morning. I had not known this. From whom? Captain Yara Ose. Veth looked up. She states, for the record, that Dmitry Vanek was not operating under military authority at any point during the Mordak Prime operation. She states that his presence at the facility was coincidental to the operation. She states that his decision to re-enter the building was made without her knowledge, and that she did not learn of it until after the strike was completed. A pause. She also states, and I am quoting directly, that she has been trying to find the right language for what he did since the day it happened, and that she is grateful someone else is trying too. The chamber was very quiet. I felt something shift in the acoustics, not physically. The stone did not move, the lighting did not change, but the particular quality of the silence altered in the way. Silence alters when a room full of people stops performing attention and begins actually paying it. Arbiter Sen looked at me for a long moment. The council will take the classification question under formal advisement, she said. The process you have described will be initiated. It will take time. I know, I said. Your procedural violations will be reviewed separately. I know that too. Is there anything else you wish to submit to the record before we adjourn? I thought about Marta Vanek at midnight, stars visible through her window. I thought about the audio log, 47 seconds, 4 seconds of silence in the middle. I thought about Fenwick's 7 words. I thought about OC's voice dropping a frequency when she said he knew. Yes, I said. One thing, I submitted the audio log directly to the chamber record. All 47 seconds. The ambient sound, the child's voice through the wall, the footsteps stopping, the 4 seconds, the footsteps turning around. Nobody spoke while it played. When it ended, the chamber returned to silence, but a different silence than before. The kind that follows something that cannot be unfollowed. The kind the Karath associate with the moment after a load-bearing wall reveals it was holding up more than anyone had calculated. Thank you, Arbiter Sen said finally. She did not say what she was thanking me for. She did not need to. I inclined my head in the formal acknowledgement and walked out of the chamber into the corridor, where the ordinary sounds of the station resumed immediately. Footsteps, ventilation, the low hum of systems running at capacity. And felt, for the first time in 4 days, that my own processing had returned to something like equilibrium. The audio log was in the record now, 47 seconds, permanent, indelible. Available to anyone who wanted to understand what had happened at Mortak Prime, in a corridor in the dark, at 60331, before anyone had decided what to make of it or what to call it or whose interests it should serve. I walked back to my office to write up the session notes. The procedural review took 11 days. I spent them doing ordinary work, 3 inheritance disputes, 1 contested kill count from a minor border incident, 1 straightforward Vorath classification that I completed in an afternoon and filed without difficulty and felt afterward the particular flatness of a task that fits its tools exactly. Director Vane did not contact me during this period. The review board convened on the 12th day. There were 5 members. I knew 2 of them professionally. Arbiter Examiner Koss, who had supervised my certification review 14 years earlier, and Senior Examiner Datha, who handled the most serious procedural violations and whose presence on the board told me something about how the Bureau had decided to characterize what I had done. They did not begin with the violations. They began with the report. Koss read 3 sections aloud. The classification failure analysis, the audio log description, the recommendation for a new category. He read them in the flat, precise cadence of someone who has read a document multiple times and is now reading it for the record rather than for understanding. When he finished, he set the document down and looked at me. You understand, he said, that the Verification Bureau's function is verification, not advocacy. Yes. Your report crosses that line in several places. Yes, the recommendation for a new classification category is outside the Bureau's statutory authority. The Bureau's statutory authority includes flagging inadequacies in existing classification frameworks and submitting formal recommendations to the High Council for remediation, I said. Section 7, Paragraph 4 of the Founding Charter. Last exercised 31 years ago in the Mleskin border dispute reclassification. Koss looked at me for a moment. You researched the precedent. At 0400, yes. Something moved across his face that in a different context I might have called respect. And in this context I categorized more carefully as professional recognition. The specific acknowledgement of one person who does thorough work for another person who does thorough work, regardless of whether the work has created a significant institutional problem. The submission pathway you used, Datha said. Direct filing to the High Arbiter's office, simultaneous public record release. The last time that pathway was used, it ended 2 careers and restructured a department. I know, I said. You used it anyway. The standard submission pathway goes through Director Vane's office, I said. Director Vane had already indicated the preferred conclusion of the report. The standard pathway would have produced a review process during which the public record release would have been delayed. The council session would have concluded, and the reclassification would have been entered before my report could be evaluated. The direct pathway was the only one that preserved the integrity of the submission timeline. That is a generous interpretation of your authority, Datha said. It is an accurate one, I said. I have the charter documentation. Another silence. The review board conferred briefly in the low-frequency register that Karath use for private deliberation in formal settings. Then Koss said, Investigator Solon, in 22 years with the Verification Bureau, you have filed 943 reports. Of those, 891 have been accepted without challenge. 47 were challenged and upheld on review. 5 were challenged and partially modified. None were retracted. No, I said. This report will not be retracted either, he said. The procedural violations are documented and will remain in your record. 2 of them carry formal censure. The submission pathway decision will be reviewed for potential charter amendment to clarify boundaries. He paused. The report itself stands. I absorbed this. Director Vane has requested your reassignment to a non-sensitive classification track, Datha said. The High Arbiter has declined his request. I absorbed this also. The High Arbiter, Koss said, has instead assigned you as the Bureau's primary liaison to the Interspecies Working Group, developing the new classification category. He looked at me steadily. You will spend the next 18 months in consultation with legal scholars from 42 member species, building the framework for a category that does not currently exist, on the basis of 47 seconds of audio from a corridor on Mortac Prime. The chamber was quiet. That seems like appropriate work, I said. It will be extremely difficult, Koss said. Most of the species involved will resist the framework on philosophical grounds. Several will challenge the foundational premise. You will be required to defend, repeatedly, the position that a 4-second interval in an undocumented decision process constitutes a legally meaningful distinction from existing classifications. I understand, do you? He looked at me with the expression of someone who has watched many investigators arrive at a conviction and wants to know whether this one has thought past the conviction to what comes after it. It would be easier, he said quietly, to let the existing system absorb this case imperfectly. File it under approximate categories. Move on. The 47 seconds would be in the record. The case would be closed. You would have your career intact and a straightforward path to senior examiner by the time you reach the mandatory review age. I know, I said, and I thought about Fenwick. That's the job. 7 words in a log that nobody had been intended to read. And that's not sufficient. Koss looked at me for a long moment. No, he said, I don't suppose it is. He closed the review file. I walked out of the chamber with 2 formal censures in my record and 18 months of work that did not yet have a name, into a corridor that hummed with the ordinary frequency of a station that did not know anything significant had just occurred. The Karath do not mark moments, we file them. I filed this one carefully and went back to work. The working group met for the first time on a station I had never visited, in a system chosen specifically because it belonged to none of the 42 participating species. Neutral ground, the oldest diplomatic technology in the galaxy. There were 31 legal scholars in the initial session. I had prepared a presentation, 43 slides, cross-referenced against 7 different legal philosophical frameworks, with the audio log embedded at slide 12 and again at slide 31. I never reached slide 12. The session opened with a Moleskin legal scholar named Thresh of the 7th Basin asking a foundational question. What is the legal distinction between an emotional response and a calculated decision? And how does that distinction generate different moral weight? I had a prepared answer. I had spent 3 weeks on the prepared answer. It was technically sound and philosophically defensible and completely inadequate. And I understood this the moment Thresh asked the question aloud in a room with 31 legal scholars from 31 different species. Because the prepared answer was Karath in its architecture, it assumed the distinction could be made through behavioral analysis and documentary evidence, that the 47 seconds could be parsed into legally meaningful intervals, that the 4-second silence could be categorized by working backward from the outcome. A Ythrian scholar named Vel Soren of the long memory said, before I could respond, "The question assumes the distinction is visible from outside. I am not certain it is." The room shifted, not physically, but the particular quality of 31 legal scholars from 31 species all reorienting simultaneously toward a premise none of them had considered before entering the room. The premise that the thing we were trying to classify might not be classifiable from the outside at all, that the legal framework we were building might need to acknowledge its own limits before it could acknowledge anything else. I set down my presentation notes. "Play the audio log," I said to the room's documentation system. 47 seconds. The ambient facility hum. The child's voice small through a wall. The footsteps. The 4 seconds. The footsteps turning around. In a room with 31 legal scholars from 31 species, the silence after the recording was different from any silence I had heard the audio log produce before. Not the formal silence of the High Council chamber. Not the private silence of my office at 0200. Something more distributed. 31 different nervous systems, 31 different evolutionary histories, 31 different relationships to the concept of a sound heard through a wall and a choice made in 4 seconds, all arriving at the same place from different directions. Vel Soren spoke first. "In Ythrian law," she said slowly, "there is a concept called memory before thought, an action taken before the deliberative process has begun. We do not assign full moral weight to such actions because we consider the deliberative process the seat of legal personhood." A pause. "But we also do not assign zero weight. We have spent 3 centuries arguing about what weight to assign," a Quilsian scholar said. "In our tradition, the obligation to respond to distress signals from any sentient being is codified as a primary duty, superseding personal survival calculations. We call it Srathven, the first hearing. The law does not ask whether you chose to hear. It asks only whether you did." A human legal observer said nothing. But I noticed her writing something in her personal notes with the focused attention of someone who has just heard her own experience described in a language she didn't know existed. I let the conversation run. For 4 hours, 31 legal scholars from 31 species talked about the 4 seconds. Not about Vanek specifically. About what happens in the interval between perception and movement, in the species of their own traditions, in the legal frameworks they had each inherited and spent careers working within, what they called it, how they weighted it, whether they had ever tried to legislate it or had decided, at some point, that legislation was the wrong tool for that particular sentient experience. By the end of the session, we had not built a framework. We had done something more useful. We had established that every legal tradition in the room had encountered the 4 seconds and none of them had resolved it, and that the reason Vanek's death had broken the Karath classification system was not because the Karath system was uniquely inadequate, but because the experience itself resisted the kind of resolution that legal systems are built to provide. You cannot legislate the 4 seconds. You can only acknowledge that they exist and build around them carefully. I wrote this in the session summary and sent it to all 31 scholars that evening. Vel Soren responded within the hour. Her message was 3 words in Ythrian that her translator rendered as, "Now we begin." I slept better that night than I had since the High Arbiter first handed me the file with 17 names. Not because the work was done. The work was nowhere near done. But because I had spent 4 hours in a room where 31 different species had each recognized the 4 seconds from inside their own traditions, which meant the 4 seconds were not a human anomaly, not a Karath classification failure, not a political problem to be managed, or a legal gap to be filled. They were something the galaxy had always known and never named. Vanek had not done something alien. He had done something so fundamentally sentient that 31 legal traditions had each tried and failed to contain it. And a maintenance contractor on a rotational assignment had simply lived it out in a corridor at 0331. without knowing he was participating in a 3-century argument about the nature of moral obligation. I thought about what Marta had said. He would have said he just did what anyone would do. Maybe that was exactly right. Maybe the 4 seconds were not extraordinary. Maybe they were the most ordinary thing in the galaxy, the thing that every species recognized, the thing that every legal tradition had orbited without landing, the thing that happened in corridors and alleyways, and burning buildings and sinking ships across 10,000 years of sentient history, unremarkable in the moment and irreducible in the record. Maybe Vanek was not the exception. Maybe he was the proof that the exception didn't exist. I filed the session summary, closed my office lights, and listened to the station hum in the dark for a while before sleeping. Webb contacted me 7 months into the working group process. The request came through an unofficial channel, flagged as personal rather than institutional, which in diplomatic terms meant he was speaking as a man rather than as a representative. He asked if we could talk. I said yes. He looked different on the communication screen than he had in the tribunal recording. Not older exactly, but more worn. The particular quality of someone who has been living inside the consequences of a large decision and has stopped being surprised by how many consequences a large decision has. His hair was grayer at the temples. He sat with the same stillness I remembered from the recording, but it read differently now, less like performance and more like something he had settled into because the alternative was exhausting. "You found Vanek," he said. "Yes, all of it. Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been following the working group's progress, the framework you're building. It will take another 8 to 11 months at minimum," I said. "The Mleskin tradition alone has 17 foundational objections that require individual resolution." "I know. I've been reading the session summaries." He paused. "You're doing it right. Taking time with it." I waited. "I want to explain," he said, "why I simplified it in the tribunal." "You don't owe me an explanation," I said. Captain O.C. explained the operational reasoning. O.C. explained the practical reasoning, he said. "That's not the same thing." He looked at something off-screen for a moment. The tribunal was a political argument. It needed to be a political argument because the Federation responds to political arguments. Everything I said was true. The framing was designed to be effective, and Vanek's truth wasn't effective. "Vanek's truth is the most important truth in the whole case," he said. "That's exactly why I couldn't use it." He looked back at me directly. "You walk into a room full of politicians and bureaucrats and you tell them 17 people died because they made choices. That's an argument. Clean, documentable, morally legible. You walk in and tell them one man turned around in a corridor because he heard a child through a wall. He stopped. That's not an argument. That's a question. And questions don't win tribunal hearings." "No," I said, "but they build classification frameworks." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Not quite its absence. The specific quality of a man encountering a true thing from an unexpected direction. "O.C. told me what you said to her," he said, "in the interview. The last question. I asked whether Vanek knew he wasn't going to make it. She said you asked it quietly." A pause. "She's been carrying that since Mortak. The knowing, the simplification. I asked her to carry it and she did, and that's a cost I put on her that I didn't have the right to put on her. She made her own choice," I said. "Yes," he said. "People keep doing that around this case." We sat with that for a moment. "The framework," he said. "When it's finished, what do you call it?" "We haven't determined the formal designation yet," I said. "The working group is still negotiating terminology across 31 legal traditions. The Ythrian proposal is closest to accurate, but it doesn't translate cleanly into standard Federation legal language." "What does it translate to?" I considered. "Approximately, the action taken before the question is asked." Webb looked at me for a long moment. "That's him," he said quietly. "That's exactly him." "Yes," I said. Another silence. Webb pressed his palm flat on the desk surface in front of him. The gesture surprised me, familiar from my own habit, and I did not know if it was coincidence or if the impulse to feel something solid and present was not as species-specific as I had assumed. "Vorik told me," he said, "that the real threat humanity poses isn't violence. It's holding up a mirror." He paused. "I think you've been doing something similar, with different tools." "I verified 17 deaths," I said. "That was the assignment. And one of them broke your classification system. One of them revealed the classification system had always had a gap," I said. "Vanek didn't create the gap. He fell through it. Webb nodded slowly. When the framework is complete, he said, I'd like to submit a formal statement to the record. From humanity, acknowledging what he did and what it cost and what it meant. A pause, not a political statement, just acknowledgement. I'll note that the working group will accept submissions from observer species during the final review period, I said. Good. He started to close the connection, then stopped. Solzlin, for what it's worth. He seemed to find it difficult to finish, which was the first time in either recording or direct conversation that I had seen Webb find anything difficult. Thank you for not letting it be simple. He closed the connection. I sat in the quiet of my office for a moment, palm on the desk, feeling the station hum through composite and stone and the long continuity of an institution that had existed before me and would exist after me and was, slowly and imperfectly, and with 17 foundational objections still pending from the Moleskine tradition, becoming something slightly more accurate than it had been before. That seemed like enough for one day. I went back to work. The framework was completed on a Tuesday, not a significant Tuesday. No particular astronomical event, no Federation holiday, no marker that would distinguish it in the historical record from any other Tuesday in the working group's 18-month consultation process. The final Moleskine objection was resolved through a compromise terminology that satisfied neither the Moleskine tradition nor the Karath classification system completely, which Thresh of the 7th Basin noted was probably the most accurate possible outcome for a legal category designed to describe something that resisted complete description. We called it unrequired return. The formal definition negotiated across 31 legal traditions and 412 hours of recorded deliberation read, an act of reorientation toward a perceived need, undertaken without institutional authority, prior calculation of outcome, or reasonable expectation of personal survival, in which the actor's movement toward the need constitutes the entirety of the available record of intent. 17 words of definition, 18 months of work. Thresh said at the final session that it was the most honest legal definition he had encountered in 40 years of practice, specifically because it admitted what it could not contain. The definition described the behavior. It explicitly declined to describe the motivation. It drew a boundary around the 4 seconds and named what was inside that boundary without pretending to explain it. I thought that was probably right. The framework was submitted to the High Council for formal adoption on a Wednesday. I filed the final working group summary, updated Vanek's case record with the new classification designation, and sat for a moment with the completed file open on my screen. Vanek, Dmitry, civilian contractor, technical grade 3, Mortak Prime Research Facility, classification unrequired return. Below the classification, the case notes I had accumulated over 18 months. Below all of that, the single line I had added to the recommendations section on the night I wrote the real report. He heard her. That is sufficient. I looked at that line for a long time. Then I did something I had not planned to do and did not fully understand until I was doing it. I requested a formal session before the High Council, not for procedural reasons, not for the framework adoption. I requested it under the provision in Karath law that allows any citizen to address the Council on a matter of public record, a provision that exists in the founding charter and has been used approximately as often as the direct submission pathway, which is to say rarely, and always by people who had decided that there was something the Council needed to hear that the Council had not asked to hear. The session was granted for the following morning. I spent the evening preparing nothing. The Council chamber looked the same as it always looked. High ceilings, absorptive surfaces, lighting calibrated to formal weight. The 7 members in their elevated arc. Arbiter Sen at the center, reading something on a document pad as I entered, looking up with the expression of someone who had not been surprised by a Verification Bureau investigator in many years and was prepared to not be surprised again. I stood at the address position. Investigator Solon, Arbiter Sen said, "You have requested time before the Council on a matter of public record." "Yes, proceed." I had prepared nothing, and so I said the only thing I had come to say. "I want to read a name into the Council record," I said, "not as part of a classification submission, not as a procedural action, simply as a matter of public acknowledgement." The Council waited. "Dmitry Vanek," I said, "civilian contractor, technical grade 3, 34 years old." He fixed atmospheric seals on rotational assignment across 9 facilities over 4 years. He was not a soldier. He was not an institutional actor. He had no strategic value to any party in the events at Mortac Prime, and no obligation to any of them beyond the ordinary obligations of a person who exists in proximity to other people. I paused. On the morning of the strike, he left the building. He had a transport waiting. He had every logistical mechanism available to not be present when the operation commenced. The chamber absorbed this in its complete way, taking the sound and leaving only the original. At 0331, he heard a child through a wall. I stopped there. The council was very still, not the formal stillness of beings performing attention, the actual stillness of beings who have stopped performing anything. He went back in, I said. He got her to the airlock. He sealed her inside from the interior panel. The airlock cycled 11 seconds before the strike. He knew the timing. Arbiter Sen looked at me without expression. Around her, the 6 other council members were various kinds of still. That is the entirety of the record, I said. There is no further documentation of his internal state. There is no testimony about his motivation. There are 47 seconds of audio from a corridor and a 4-second interval that the Karath classification system and 30 other legal traditions spent 18 months learning to describe. I looked at the council directly. I am not asking for a ruling, I said. I am not submitting a recommendation. I am asking the council to hear his name in this chamber in the formal record without a classification attached to it. Just the name, just what he did. Silence. Dmitry Vanek, I said again. He heard her. The chamber held the sound. Arbiter Sen set down her document pad. She looked at me for a long moment, with the expression of someone who has lived inside an institution for many decades, and has not often encountered a moment that the institution did not have a protocol for. Then she inclined her head, not the fractional professional acknowledgement of a superior to a subordinate. The full formal inclination, the Karath gesture of recognition between equals, offered to someone who has done something that the offering party cannot match but can honor. One by one, the other 6 council members inclined their heads. No ruling, no classification. No formal action entered into the record beyond the words themselves, which were now permanent, which was enough. I inclined my head in return. Then I walked out of the chamber into the corridor, where the stations hummed with the ordinary frequency of a place that did not know anything had just occurred, and stood for a moment with my palm flat against the wall, feeling the vibration move through composite and stone. Steady, present, indifferent. I was not indifferent. I filed that in the place where the Karath file things that do not have categories, which is not a formal location in the bureau system, but which every investigator I have ever known maintains privately as a matter of professional necessity. Then I went back to work. 4 months later, the High Council formally adopted unrequired return into Karath jurisprudence. The adoption ceremony was brief and procedurally precise, which is how the Karath prefer to mark things that matter. Not with flourish, but with the specific gravity of an institution changing its foundational structure in front of witnesses, which is the most serious thing an institution can do. I was not present. I had a classification review scheduled that morning that I did not reschedule because the review involved a disputed inheritance case for a Moleskin family who had been waiting 11 months for resolution and whose waiting was not less important because something larger was happening simultaneously in a chamber on another level of the station. I read the adoption notice on my documentation feed between the second and third witness interviews. I noted it, filed it, and returned to the inheritance case. Webb submitted his formal statement to the record 3 days after adoption. It was short, 4 paragraphs plainly written, the language of someone who had chosen simplicity over rhetoric because the subject did not require rhetoric and would have been diminished by it. He described Vanek as a man he had never met. He described learning about the airlock, about the 11 seconds, about the 4-second interval in the audio log. He wrote that humanity did not consider Vanek's death a military action or an institutional outcome, and that the human government formally acknowledged it as what it was, a man, alone, doing what he could with what he had. The last line of Webb's statement read, "We don't know why he turned around. We're grateful he did. We thought you should know we're grateful." I read it twice, filed it in the case record, sent a formal acknowledgement to the Human Diplomatic Office. That evening I received a message from Marta Vanek. She had been informed of the framework adoption through the contractor administration system. The message was short. I looked up the definition. It says, "The action taken before the question is asked." I've been thinking about that. He never waited to know if things were going to work out. He just started fixing them. I suppose that's what the definition is describing. Thank you for the word. I sat with that for a long time. Then I opened the case file for the last time, scrolled to the bottom of the documentation record, and added a final notation in the field reserved for investigators' closing remarks. I wrote, "Case closed, classification, unrequired return. The record is sufficient." Below that, because it was true and because it belonged in the permanent file alongside everything else, I wrote one more line. Anya is 6 years old. She lives on a moon in a system that appears on trade charts only as a fuel depot notation. She does not know his name. I looked at that sentence. Then I added, "She will." I submitted the file, watched it move through the confirmation sequence, and felt the particular quality of a thing completed, not resolved. Because some things cannot be resolved, only documented and carried, but completed in the sense that the record was now whole, that every true thing I had been able to find was in its proper place, that 47 seconds of audio from a corridor on Mortac Prime were permanent in the archive of 32 legal traditions, and would be there for anyone who came looking. 6 months later, I was assigned a new case. The file contained 23 names. I pressed my palm flat on the desk, felt the station hum move through the composite surface, and opened the first page. At the bottom of the briefing document, in the field where the High Arbiter occasionally left personal notes for assigned investigators, there were 4 words in her formal hand. "Find what matters here." I began to read.